Welcome back to another episode of the Victory of Vices podcast, brought to you commercial-free by addictionhelp.com. I am your host, Dan Hauser, and today we're going to take a look at the question of, is being a sports fan healthy mentally? Let's get into the show. So I was actually inspired to do this episode after watching the college football playoff selection show, and when they announced the 14 playoff, and 13-0 Florida State was not in it. And so for those of you listening to this or watching this who may not be sports fans or college football fans, Florida State finished the regular season 13-0. They did not get a playoff spot. Instead, those final two spots went to one loss Texas and one loss Alabama, making Florida State the first undefeated team in a Power 5 or major conference to be left out of the college football playoff since the playoff was created. And so, while I admit, especially as a University of Miami fan, although ironically enough, I'm kind of wearing Florida State colors today, while I do admit that I got a little bit of joy out of the chaos that ensued, I also couldn't help but notice that everyone was losing their minds, especially on Twitter. And when I say everyone, I mean FSU fans, college football pundits, even politicians, including Rick Scott, governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, and even Florida's attorney general, who are all now, in the case of Rick Scott, he's trying to get Congress involved. Ron DeSantis earmarked $1 million to try to sue the college football playoff. Florida's attorney general has now gone so far as to begin discussions as far as actually suing the college football playoff committee. So it's wild. It's crazy. But then beyond just that, this isn't anything new. It's new that it's happening to Florida State. It's new in the context of the first undefeated team to get left out of the college football playoff. But sports fans in general losing their minds now on the internet, and it used to be pre-social media days, it would be in like local, call-in shows or message boards or whatever it was, yelling at each other, literally around the water cooler. Sports fans have been acting irrationally when it comes to their teams for as long as sports has existed. I mean, let's be real. So, and now also in the day of social media now, and everyone having recording devices on their phones and whatnot, obviously things have gone viral too, from the standpoint of videos of fans smashing their TVs, throwing something at their TVs, acting just in a crazy way, whether it's, maybe a missed kick at the end of the game for their team to lose, or a made kick by the other team at the end of the game, or a shot, anything that happens as far as like the final play of a game and it goes one way or another. But then also on the flip side of that, obviously we feel just so much joy in our lives when our teams, accomplish something big, whether it's winning a big game or winning a championship or, anything positive. I mean, really quick side note, when the Florida Panthers this year were making their Stanley Cup playoff run, it was the first time since 1996. And so for me, there were just, I can't even describe the joys that I felt watching that team make that playoff run, because it was the first time in my adult life I got to experience that. The last time I experienced it, I was a child. And so, when we have moments like that in our lives, it gives us joy in ways that few other things do. But, because we have such extreme highs and such extreme lows when it comes to being a football fan, or not a football fan, a sports fan, it got me thinking, and, is it actually healthy to be a sports fan these days? And no, I don't mean physically from the standpoint of eating all those chicken wings on Sunday during football games. I mean mentally. Like, is it mentally healthy for us to essentially live and die by something that we can't control? And so, as we often do on the show, as I love to do, questions like this pop in my head, and I love to run with them, and I love to create episodes around them. But when we come back, I'm going to be joined by living legend Connie Nicholas Carberg, the NFL's first woman scout and a diehard New York Jets fan, to talk about some of the details of both the agony and ecstasy of being a sports fan and what that's like in today's modern age. And then later on in the show, I'm going to be joined by Joshua Norman, clinical assistant professor of psychology and behavioral health at the Ohio State University, to take a look at the psychological side of being a sports fan, and maybe even get some tips on things we can all do in our lives as sports fans to try and preserve our mental health. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to the show, everyone. I am joined today by a very, very special guest. For those of you watching, you can see her on the screen with me right now. It is Connie Carberg. She was the first woman scout in the history of the NFL with the New York Jets, and of course, a diehard Jets fan herself. So, Connie, thank you so much for coming on the show with me today.
Oh, my pleasure to be on, Dan. I'm looking forward to it.
And so for those of you who also may not know, although you may know now by the last name, Connie is also our lovely co-founder and executive producer, Chris Carberg's mom, which we'll get into a little bit more on that side of things here in a little bit too, because he, of course, as you guys know from previous episodes, is also a diehard Jets fan. Go figure, right? Growing up in that household. But
yeah, no choice.
So
no choice.
Yeah, right. as so many of us, and we'll talk about that a little bit more too. So many of us, sports fans, we didn't really almost get a choice. It was you kind of were the fan of the house that you grew up in, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit as well too. But right out of the gate, Connie, and I mentioned it just here a second ago. Obviously, you are a big Jets fan. You also work for the Jets, so your story as far as your Jets fandom goes is a little bit different than most people's. So if you just kind of wanted to share with us both your fandom with the Jets, where it came from, also your experience working with the team, and just kind of tell the audience a little bit about yourself before we get started here.
Sure, Dan, I'd be happy to. I started out just when I was growing up playing all different sports. I was a tomboy and with my two brothers playing all the time. But you played baseball and softball and basketball, all that type of thing. But football really still, this is back, in the 1960s. So football still wasn't a thing for females really at all. But then when I turned 13, my father, Dr. Calvin Nicholas, and my uncle, Dr. James Nicholas, became the two team doctors for the Titans, who then became the New York Jets. And that changed everything in my life. Oh, I figured I better start learning about football. And I was lucky enough to have an earth science teacher that I would correct papers, and he would teach me football, and he came to the games with us. So I learned a lot. And Walt Michaels, who was the defensive coordinator, was at the house all the time for the Super Bowl III. He was always over players. It was very relaxed back then. And we would all hang out, players and families, at each other's houses. So it was just a great way, to grow up. My father had his office connected to the house, so players would come to be examined. And so we would see them all there. So as I said, it was a great way. And I just developed more and more of a loving of the game and learning the game of football. And back then, there were no computers, and one game was on during the week, and you had a Street and Smith magazine. But for some reason, when I was 16, I started making my own mock drafts. Don't even ask me how, why, or what. But I would just take magazine and Bob Hope's All-American team, and then the one game, and pick out favorite players. And that kind of just started that interest, even though there was, I don't even know why. And I went to an all-girls college. You were doing
fantasy football long before fantasy football existed, huh?
Yes, very true. And the Jets won the Super Bowl when I was a senior in high school. So that was the epitome. Super Bowl III, the only Super Bowl the Jets have won. And I was at the game down at the Orange Bowl. It was awesome with Joe Namath. When Joe Namath got signed in 1965, that was such a big deal. The first bonus baby. He was, a heartthrob. He was a great football player. He was everything. So that kindled more. I went to an all-girls college for 2 years, Wheaton, but they didn't have girls scholarships. And I played basketball there 2 years. Back in those days, they still didn't have scholarships for women. And then, but there was something missing. So I transferred to the Ohio State University. And that was the best move I could have made. So I went there. I didn't play basketball. Instead, I was with my sorority, and I was president there. And then one day I went over to the Union, where Coach Woody Hayes was kind of like the Nick Saban of the old days. And I went over that's where they would eat. And when he came out, I had his book called You Win with People. And I asked him to sign it. He did. I still have the book. And we talked for a long time. And he said, man, you really love football. Why don't you come on over to the stadium and my office, and we'll talk for a while. So when we did that, and at the time he said, you know what? After we talked for a while, I said, there really isn't anything for women. Now, remember, back in those days, this is 1971 to 74. They hadn't even started the pre-game shows. Phyllis George was the first one, the Miss America with Irv Cross, Brent Musburger, and stuff. But there were no women sideline reporters and scouts or coaches or strength and conditioning or trainers or anything. So he said, there really isn't much, but I don't want you to give up on your passion. He said, I can see how much you love football, how it is your passion, and you never know where life's going to take you. So he said, I want you to come to any practice, even if it's closed to the scouts, you're welcome to come. When they do come, you talk with them, you learn, talk to the players, learn everything that you can, which I did. I graduated in 74, and I thought I was going to, which I did Babel in high school, where I grew up on Long Island. I thought that I was going to teach and also coach girls sports, because then Title IX had just passed, things were just happening. And all of a sudden, my father had a 50th birthday party, and Charlie Winter, the head coach of the Jets, was there. I went over and table hop talked to him. He said, boy, you really love football. We're building talk about timing and how God works in many ways. He said, we're building a brand new complex at Hofstra where the Jets train. Would you consider working there? And that's where it all began. That's what was the first thing that it took. And I was the first person in and the last person to leave. I loved every minute of it. And I went in as a receptionist and scouting secretary to start with. And I was the only girl in the building at that time. After I did that, I started working there. And so that was 1974. In 1975, we were doing the draft. I was fortunate enough to me, it's still the epitome of everything, is being in the draft room when they're actually discussing the players, doing the draft, and I would call it in. I would say the New York Jets select, and you call it into New York. So it was great. It was 17 rounds at that time. And again, no computers, no pre-draft physicals, no combine, everything done by hand and typewriter. And the other part was I didn't know how to be a secretary because I didn't study to be it. So I had to fake it. But luckily they liked my passion and my learning. And I always tell people and students that I speak with, you can learn skills, but attitude is what's most important, and how you come across and be willing to work and do anything that they ask and be there on time. And I was very fortunate. Well, we got down to the 17th round, and my boss, Mike Holloway, and Al Ward, who was a general manager, said, you're going to make the last pick, because back then it was 17 rounds. So I did. I drafted Mike Bartosik. I'm still the only female to actually make a draft pick, even though it was 17 rounds. And so after that, I was still working, and then I was put up on the second floor. They built a new floor upstairs and doing more things there. And then one day we were doing game plans back in the locker room. Every Tuesday we would sit in the locker room, order Chinese food with the coaches, and we'd be typing and doing stuff for the game plans. And that's when Al Ward and Mike Holloway said, Connie, we want you to do some scouting for us. And that's how it began. I didn't ask for it. I said, great. And it wasn't made a big deal of. I just thought that was very normal. The one thing I had confidence in growing up was football. I didn't have confidence in myself with dating, with that. I didn't go to my prom, all these different things. So I didn't have confidence in myself that way. But football, I could talk and be around all the time. So that's where that began. So I went out to Ohio State. Woody was great to me there. Went to Boston College, went down to the Orange Bowl, went to a bunch of places and wrote up reports. Then also did, it was reel to reel back then. And I would look at the reel to reel. I would grade the films of all the different players, whether it was Tony Dorsett or Hugh Green or different people that were coming out, Matt Millen, all different people through the years of 74 to 81. And it was great. So I did all that in fact, even on my first date, actually not my first date, but a second or third date with my husband, we were looking at films of Joe Delaney of the Kansas City Chiefs, who eventually got drafted by the Chiefs. So it was just great. It was my life. I loved every single minute of it. And that was back in 75 to 76 until about 78. And then, of course, the big thing happened in 79, which we can get into whenever you want.
No, that's fantastic. So part of the reason why I wanted to have you on today is because the theme of the show is kind of sports fandom and how it kind of affects us mentally. And I thought to myself, outside of Florida State fans these last few weeks, there's probably no other fan base that's been quite as tortured this season as the Jets. So I'm not going to get too much into it. Obviously, you have lived it all season, but for those out there, just kind of a quick recap. So this past offseason, you guys bring in Aaron Rodgers. You hook him up with Nathaniel Hackett. He brings in a couple of his guys, Lazard and Randall Cobb, to kind of run it all back, so to say, with their success there in Green Bay. You also bring in Dalvin Cook there to partner with Breece Hall in the backfield. The defense is already fantastic, and it's been what it's been all season. And so it appeared on paper, at least going into the season, that for the first time in probably 25 years, the AFC East was going to be loaded, truly loaded, and have nothing to do with the New England Patriots. So I think we were all, as fellow fans of teams in the AFC East that are not the Patriots, we were happy to finally say, okay, it's finally going to be somebody else's turn, so to say, this year. And then, first game goes the way it does, obviously, but then the Jets still managed to win that first game. And so it's still like, okay, maybe this isn't going to be a disaster after all. The season keeps going. Obviously, it went south quickly. The quarterback carousel that happened, there was some infighting in the locker room. Saleh sometimes not seeming like he had a ton of confidence in himself or the quarterbacks at different points. And then so while all this was going on, obviously, Jets Twitter, which you're a big part of, kind of was starting to melt down a little bit. And so that's a very roundabout way of saying and asking the question of what's it been like to have been a Jets fan this season so far.
It really was a shocker. When I was every year for the past, it'll be 60 years next summer that I've been going to training camp. My husband was very understanding after I left the Jets. We got married, and I would come up every summer. So of course this summer, I went up there. I went to Canton, first of all, for the Hall of Fame, because the Jets had Joe Klecko and Darrelle Revis go into the Hall of Fame. So I went there, and I volunteer and I help with the signings and these different things that go on there. And then I went back to Jet Camp, and it was so exciting because everybody was talking about Aaron Rodgers and the signings, and everybody was saying Super Bowl or bust. I wasn't. I was just, if I make the playoffs, I was going to be happy. But so many people were, and the hopes and the everything. You just could have. It was electric all summer at training camp, And then 4 plays in to have it all change so drastically with his Achilles. Was really a tough thing, to take and to go through and to say, oh, now what are we going to do? And how is it going to be? And how are they going to adjust? And of course, as you know, from Jets Twitter, which I dearly love, I've met so many wonderful people on Jets Twitter. We talk all the time. Everybody's together, but we all have a tendency to get too crazy one way or the other. And like all NFL fans, you go week to week. 1 week you're up, 1 week you're down. 1 week this guy's a hero, the next week he's a bum. So it was like that. But the loyalty of Jets fans is something that I love, and Jets Twitter is a prime example of that.
So you're in a unique position because you are a massive Jets fan, but you also worked in the league. So you were able to build that connection up with not just the fans, but with players over the years, and you continue to keep that connection with both current and former players of more of the modern age, because obviously you go to training camp every year, you meet these people, you form these bonds of connection. So this season, and I follow you on Twitter, so I've seen it all, and it's been interesting and fun at times to watch. You interact obviously with the fans on Twitter a lot. You also interact with current and former players on Twitter a lot. So what's that been like for you so far this year, as far as the interactions you've had with both fans and former players? And have you seen a difference, so to say, in that interaction you have with fans versus that interaction you have with former players and current players? Because obviously the player mentality is different than the fan mentality.
Yeah. And, first of all, things have changed. Jets have gone through a lot of different downs and a few ups through the years, but they didn't have social media, and that changed the entire landscape. And in fact, when my son made my website about 12 years ago, he said, I just want to put it in there that you were the first female scout. That was it. We had no idea that whether it's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the other things were going to explode the way they did. But the fans, as I said, yes. And there's all different kinds and and what's nice is too, you also get to follow the beat writers, the articles, and that's all that kind of stuff. And so it goes back and forth. The players, it's a way of, they connect with the fans, and fans feel like they can talk to a player. Sometimes it goes a little far because, fans can say things that are negative, or because of fantasy football or betting or something like that, they can say things that aren't that nice to players. And then players get a little bit upset with it. So things can go rocky that way. I've luckily never had that problem with them because they know that I am always there for them. When you meet them and you see them as human beings, you know what they're going through. how hard they're trying, and the huge majority are just super guys. So I think that is the hardest part. But as I said, so I think the best part is that people are able to connect and talk to these people that they never thought they would be able to.
So in a year like this in particular, that's been so emotionally taxing on you and Jets fans as a whole, do you ever kind of take a step back, or even just wake up one morning and just say, what am I doing? Why am I allowing myself to feel this way over something as arbitrary as a sports team that I'm not a part? Like, I don't play in the games, I watch as a fan, but are there ever times where you just say, like, what am I doing here?
It's funny. For myself, because of my connections when I was younger, there's no way that is so ingrained in me forever, win or lose or whatever. I mean, I had times when I moved to Florida with my husband that I could have tried with the Dolphins and everything, but there's no way that my heart could ever let me switch. And that's what a fan is short for, fanatic, as they say. And so when I see all these people too, that are men and women, young people, old people, and all different kinds of people, the way they don't even have that connection that I had, that I was blessed to have. And they have that love and that passion for the team. And they remember every play from every year and who did what, even sometimes even better than I do, their memories. Of course, now that I'm older, I don't remember half as much, but that is what it's something I don't think you can, change if you're a true fan. Some people, like in the NBA, they more root for individuals, but it's still in football, you root for the team. You like that. Yes, you root for the individuals on the team, but you still are team oriented. And people start rooting for teams for so many different reasons. It could be, I was out at USC speaking, and I asked people, why do you root for the team that you root for? And it was really interesting. Some people said because my parents did, or this and that. So another person said, I like their colors, if they were purple or if they were red or whatever it may be. Another person said, well, my father likes the Cowboys, so I wanted to go against what he likes, so I chose the Giants or the Eagles. Other people, because some people go where the area where they live, and even when they move, they stay with their team. A few will change when they move, but I'd say a good majority will stick with that team if it was from a very young age. So I think I could never switch. And I really admire all the people out there that just form, whether it's the college, the school they went to, or the pros, the way they live and die with that team.
So once again, especially in a year like this, where being a Jets fan has been so stressful and emotional, what are some things that you do every week to kind of manage those stress and emotions, so that way you're not getting too up or too down, especially, with every play or every whistle?
I have to tell you, it really in fact, I think I wrote this down, that even after 60 years, it still hurts just as bad when they lose. And that's that Monday after. I remember when I worked there, and even now, it affects the whole week. It changes your whole outlook. It's so silly, but it's true. You just have a little more bounce in your step, and you just feel a little bit better. Even when you're having a losing season, when they win, it can really affect your whole outlook. And that's what is so crazy about sports, the way it does. But I think it's something that's, something that we really love, because it's, first of all, it's merit-based. These guys are out on the field giving everything, and somebody wins and somebody loses, and there's no in between, really. Once in a while there's a tie, but usually everybody wins. And so you got to go with it. And how I handle it is just time during the week, and trying not to let myself get too far ahead. But I have to admit, after games, when I go to bed that night, I'm hurting. And even the next day, my father always used to say, by Tuesday, when he would go in to examine the players after Sunday, you couldn't tell a lot of times if they won or lost. And I'd say, how could that be? Because all fans are hurting all week. And he'd say, no, they're able to just turn it, because they have to. And they're able to turn the page. Like when they say, we watch the film, we go over it, see what we did right and wrong, and on to the next week. And it was really true. But fans, it stays with them, I think, a lot longer.
Oh, absolutely. The Dolphins Titans game. It was a Monday night game, so already I'm staying up late for that one. So I already know going into Tuesday I'm going to be tired. And then on top of that, the way that game ended, so I woke up Tuesday morning. I'm like, I'm already tired because I was up late watching this game, and then they also lost, and it was just like there was like a sour taste in my mouth almost to start the day because I was like annoyed that I was tired, and then on top of that, they lost too. So yeah, I think that all of us can as sports fans can relate to that next day after a loss, and it's just like you kind of wake up and you're just like something just your day already feels off before you've even gotten started just because you still have that like sour taste in your mouth from the day before.
Yeah, and a lot of the young people too. I don't know how it is now, but when I was growing up, before the Jets won the Super Bowl, and they weren't that great a team, and everybody when I would go into school as a high school kid, and they would say, "What happened to your Jets?" And you would have to go through all that, and then when they win, boy, and you walk in so proud, and it's a great feeling. As I said, it's the craziest thing as to why we do it and why we keep doing it, but it's almost impossible to turn it off, I think.
So you mentioned when you were talking about your upbringing with the Jets, you mentioned Super Bowl III. I want to go talk about that here for a minute. So for those listening or watching that may not know, the modern day NFL that we have now did not always exist. In fact, back then there were two separate leagues. There was the AFL and there was the NFL. And for the most part, the NFL was the superior of the two leagues. And so Super Bowl III happens, and you mentioned, the Jets win, and nobody was really, I don't think, well, I shouldn't say nobody. I think it was a shock to many that the Jets won that Super Bowl. And so first off, what was it like being a fan of an AFL team back in those days? And then also, what was it like watching that Super Bowl and then the Jets winning, and then everything that happened after that Super Bowl win?
It was really interesting because we played. Joe Namath came to us in '65. The year before that was Matt Snell, and there was a bidding war between the AFL and NFL. They started fighting over players and signing them. That started. And Joe also got drafted by the St. Louis Cardinals in the NFL. So it was going, that's why the merger kind of got forced, because people started bidding. It was, how we've had the USFL and other things, but this was really, for some reason, the AFL really had a great bunch of original owners, and they just kept going. But the NFL did. They were the established league. They were, I don't want to say more every day, but they were more, the AFL was more wide open. It's more like football of today, throw bombs, everything was just wide open, whether it was Hadel to Allworth and then Namath to Maynard and that type of thing. So it was a very exciting game. And the NFL was still, I don't want to say plotting, but it was just different. But the Giants especially, being in New York, the Giants really looked down their nose at the Jets. So a lot of people in today's world, they see the Patriots, because of course, most of the people now were all the 23 years of Tom Brady. They saw that as their rival. Before that, it was the Dolphins with the Marino and Kenny O'Brien. But before that, it was the Giants. And when we won the Super Bowl, I guess we were 17 to 18 point underdogs, and they had just won like 30-0 in their NFC Championship game. They were amazing. Nobody thought we were really going to win. And then Joe Namath guaranteed it. And we went out and played a great game. But then on top of it, that following summer, it was only a preseason game, but preseason games, everybody played back in those days, and everybody hit, and there was 2-a-day practices, and it was different. And we played, and we beat the Giants in the Yale Bowl. And Joe Namath, Billy Mathis, a lot of the guys said that was just as important as the Super Bowl, because now we truly own New York completely, not just from the Super Bowl, but beating the Giants. And then Allie Sherman, who was a coach then, got fired after that. And then the merger came with the two leagues, and they moved a couple of teams around, and things, and then we won the following year with the Kansas City Chiefs. And so then the AFL was then accepted. Things started coming together, but it was tough in the beginning because people did. And I said, that's where my dislike of the Giants and that part come through, because that's where I grew up. As I said, this generation says, well, I like the Giants and the Jets. I go, wait a minute, how can you? Do you like the Mets and the Yankees? And they go, no. I said, do you like the Islanders and the Rangers? They go, no. I go, do you like the Knicks and the Nets? No. I said, well, why would you like the Giants and the Jets? They're both in the same area. And they said, well, even if they're not in the same, one's in the NFC and one's in the AFC. you still, to me, I love when they play each other. To me, it's still a big rivalry. I may be in the minority, but that's what I believe.
Well, I was just about to ask you that too. Obviously, in today's modern NFL, the big Jets rivalries, it's Jets Patriots, it's Jets Dolphins, like you mentioned. But in your time, it was Jets Giants. Do you still view the Giants as the Jets' biggest rival, even though they only play each other once every, I believe, 3 or 4 years? Do you still view that as the big rivalry there?
Yeah, it's funny. My older brother was a ball boy way back. He passed away recently, but my older brother was a ball boy before I worked for the Jets and everything. And he and I both, we did the day after a game, after the games are played, the Giants are still, we go, oh, I just feel so good when they lose and we win. Or even if we lose, it helps that they lose. So this whole thing with Tommy DeVito is kind of tough right now. So, that's the only thing. So I'll always, because, I think all of us, when you grow up, you kind of form those different things and what you're growing up with. As I said, I don't expect young people that are really starting with maybe the year 2000 or even in the 80s. They just wouldn't have the same feelings.
On a quick unrelated note, I did think it was kind of cool, though, that this past week, both Zach Wilson and Tommy DeVito won Offensive Players of the Week for the AFC and NFC. It was an all Jets award week. All New York award week. So I thought that was kind of cool. You mentioned too.
Who would ever predict that?
Yeah, I know, right? Certainly nobody at the start of the year, that's for sure. When everyone assumed it was going to be Rodgers every week. But so you mentioned off the top too that you have an athletic background yourself. Obviously, you have spent your fair share of time around athletes in your professional career too, and even now you spend a lot of time interacting with them, both when you go up for training camp and like we talked about on Twitter. So you have the mindset of an athlete. You have also spent a lot of time around athletes, both modern day and athletes of old, so to say. Social media obviously has changed the way that fans can interact with these athletes. Obviously, it was one thing back in the day where you could boo or you could yell at them in the stadium. They would go home and then they could kind of get away from it all and sit in peace and quiet and be away from it. Now, it doesn't really stop. Fans can go on and they can send things on Twitter or Instagram or social media. And obviously players can choose to block it out or not, but especially the modern day athletes, they grew up in that social media world. So it's tough for them to just say, I'm just not going to go on.
Right.
What do you see as far as, because you saw how the way fan reactions affected athletes, say 30 years ago, and you see how fan reactions affect athletes now as fans have more access to these athletes. What do you see happening as far as the athlete of today compared to the athlete of old when it comes to those fan interactions and it comes to some of the mental anguish involved? Because obviously, we're upset as fans when bad things happen, but they're upset too. I mean, it's their livelihood at the end of the day. So how have you seen that evolution affect athletes?
I think, as I said, back then, as you said, there was no social media. There really weren't even sports shows. We have 24/7 radio, TV, everything bombarded. You played your game on Sunday. There was a show on Sunday night called Bill Mazer. And other than that, then you waited till the next weekend to play your game. So during the week, unless you were a real fan, you didn't really discuss it that much. It was just a very different world. And we didn't get all the other games. You basically got your home team game, unless they didn't, if they sold out, then you could watch the game. If not, you didn't get to watch that. So the other part that I say is, I think now, again, because of and I'm not anti, but fantasy football, I think, has changed a lot of things, because people have their players that they choose and they want them to play certain, they'll go up to players and say, hey, you didn't score this touchdown. Why did you go down before on the 1 yard line? I know that made you win the game, but it killed my fantasy team, and things like that. It never would have happened because they have money. Usually it comes down to having money on it. Sometimes it's just for the fun of it. But then there's always been gambling. But now the accessibility, and it's not just whether your team wins or loses. It's based on how many points, how many times, how many catches per guy, what's going to happen on this. Everything is like minute, broken down, that you can place bets on everything. And I think as a result, with anything, when it comes down to people's money, then they see these players more as, why are you doing this to me? Versus, you're my guy no matter what. And that's why I don't play fantasy myself, because I would only take the Jets. I could never, first of all, I can't root for another team, but I want to feel the feelings completely. I don't have anything against it, but that's just me. And I certainly would never bet. And I'm the lousiest predictor in the world, but football, as you can see, football is just the craziest thing. You can score like last night. We saw a team that scored no points the week before scores, 63 last night. Every week, Aaron Rodgers said that on Pat McAfee too. He said, 1 week you're high and you're a hero and everything else, and the next week you're a bum. So it does, and it just goes back and forth. So, and we all tend to project. So I think that's the biggest difference. So the players, and plus it was a lot more open. You didn't have, you can talk to players on social media, but back then when Jets were a training camp, they would have morning and afternoon practice and they would walk over to lunch. People could just stop by, talk to the players. It was very loose. There was no security for coaches or players. There was nothing like that. And so it was very, very friendly, as I said. So things have really changed that way. I would have somebody that was a fan of a player and I could just go back to the locker room and yell girl back and say, David Knight, I have somebody that's a real fan of yours. When you get done, will you come up front and talk to them on the phone? Well, of course, those things don't happen now. So there's a lot of differences. There's some good things and some things that I think really make it tough on these guys.
Yeah, it's funny you mention fantasy football. I do play fantasy, and it's tough for me some years to draft Jets or Bills or Patriots players on my team because it's like it just feels icky knowing that I have to root for them because I don't want to root for them. I'm a Dolphins fan, like I don't want to root for those guys, So I definitely can understand that too, and it does sometimes sway your decision making as far as like getting those guys in your team. Because like I don't want to, all those years with Tom Brady, obviously with the Patriots, he was the best quarterback in the league. It's like I don't want to draft Tom Brady because then I got to root for him to play good, and I don't want to have to root for him to play good, and so
exactly. Then when he goes to Tampa Bay, then you can take him, right? Yes, yes.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But so we mentioned obviously you are the son of our fantastic co-founder and executive producer of the show, Chris. And Chris and I have had our fair share of conversations both on and off the air about the Jets, especially this season and his Jets fandom. He like you is absolutely someone that wears the emotions of the Jets on his sleeve. And so, it's one thing when for you to kind of handle your reaction certain ways to things. But when you're watching the game with him or talking to him the next day after a game and it was a brutal loss, does it ever trying to think how I want to put it, does it ever kind of hurt you to see him so emotionally drained from a game or hurting after a game, or how do you react when you see his reactions?
Yeah. One thing good, we watch, he and I, my husband said he lives 10 minutes away from me with his wife and my 2 grandkids, but he usually comes over for the game. I don't like to watch with many people, but he keeps me a little bit sane. And so when we watch together, so this way we both are kind of balancing each other out. But I do feel because I know when it hurts, and the hard part is he never experienced a Super Bowl. And that's what I feel for so many of the fans out there of the Jets, that they never got to experience what I did. Even though I was, 17 years old, I still, of course, remember it. And those days with, Joe Namath and George Sauer and Don Maynard and Emerson Boozer and Matt Snell and all these great players that we had, Jerry Philbin and, just so many different guys, and growing up with all those guys. So in that respect, I was really blessed. He doesn't have all that. He got to go with the Rex Ryan and go to 2 AFC games and understand what was happening there. And when Chad Pennington was playing and took us to the playoffs, and then he went to your Dolphins and won the AFC East, but it does hurt. But we talk, it's good because we can talk it out. And he started this thing about 4 games ago because things looked a little bit bleak. And he said, Mom, we can either be serious or we can have a little bit of fun. And I go, what does that mean? And we're watching the game. And he goes, well, I just put on Twitter that you're going to do a dance. You're going to do the gritty. I go, I can't do the gritty. And he says, yeah, you're going to do the gritty. I go, I can't do that. And so he said, yes. He said, at that time, we didn't know if we were going to win. He said, but I told him, if we win, you will. So we won. And then the next week we won. And the next week we won. So it was 3 games in a row, then a couple of games, then 4 or 5 games without it. And then this past week got to do it again. But it was kind of neat that he was able to, as I said, balance things a little bit. And he has a memory too go. I used to bring him from the time he was 4 months old. I would bring him to the Jets camp with me every summer. So he grew up around the guys, all the time. When Pete Carroll was there, he got to be a ball boy. And Pete was coach. He was an amazing guy, Pete Carroll. And he got to work with all the kickers and do all that kind of stuff. Nick Lowry and Brian Hansen. So he, as I said, he has a lot of great memories with those days. And then he also got to know the guy that I helped draft in Mark Gastineau. And so that was great too. So as I said, once you meet a few of the players, it really does help.
Oh, you can put me on that list of people that love watching your post game gritties when you do them. So those are always fun for me to fire up Twitter and see after a Jets win. So, but
so poor.
You mentioned a little earlier when I asked, so kind of, do you ever say to yourself, what am I doing here? And obviously, I don't think there's ever going to be a day where you're not going to be the Jets fan that you are. But over the years, and especially in a year like this, how do you continue to keep kind of rekindling your love for the team? How do you keep, especially in a year like this where it's been so challenging, how do you almost just not just walk away from a sense and just say, you know what, sometimes it may just be easier if I just, not for good, but if I just take a step back and say, all right, I'm out for the rest of this year and we'll start again next year.
Yeah, that could never happen. But when I was growing up and everything, as I said, we went through a lot of things. Then when I worked for the Jets in those 8 years, they never had a winning season. They never had above 500. So every Monday that I would go in, I went through 3 coaches and general managers and director of player personnel. So I know how it is and how they feel. So in that respect, it's so hard for me to be negative because I see them as people. But it is, your heart hurts. You get into, it's amazing how you can watch a game and just feel so passionate. It's a phenomenon that, as I said, I think this is so neat. And you watch people, the Jets have a series on One Jet Drive called Diehards. And it's so neat. They've been doing like Gotham City Crew, and they did these other people, these fans, and they come from everywhere. I have a good friend, Donna, who lives in Delaware, and she drives up for games. I have another friend who lives in California, and he's a season ticket holder, and he stayed loyal to the Jets, and he flies back in for the games. So, I mean, it's really totally amazing how people, even when I lived in South Florida, there were tons of Jet fans, just tons, because so many moved from New York down to Florida. And as I said, people, so it's amazing. Just as soon as I proudly wear my gear, whether win or lose, but that's just me. I guess everybody has to handle it in their own way, for their own sanity and what makes them feel okay. And I think, podcasts and finding out that there are so many people that feel the way you do is always comforting. You think you're alone, but you're not.
No, absolutely. And we've talked about it too. The community bond there kind of helps a lot. I think one big point of contention for fans is not just Jets fans, but fans across the league this year, has been the performance of referees. We have seen plenty of referee talk on Twitter. Like I said, not just from the Jets, from all fan bases. I think we can all agree as a collective whole of football fans, the refereeing this year has been probably about as bad as we've seen since that year where we had the replacement refs come in for a while. How do you think referee performance in general changes the viewing experience for fans and how they react to the games now?
First of all, it's a very tough job. Let's put it that way. First of all, it is, no matter whether you're doing it on the high school level, college, or anything like that. We got to, it's really a thankless job. So the less you're noticed, probably the better. But there's so many new rules, and so many rules that are subjective, not really clear. It's really amazing. I love the part when they go up to like Gene Steratore, it was a retired ref, in the booth, and they ask him right away, and he can get it. And I wish they would do something like that and just let him kind of talk down to the people. I know they talk to New York, and the rest do you've got to figure they probably do 90% at least well. But all of us feel, on those pass interferences, on holding calls, everything is tough because they can call it like they say on most plays. Most of us as fans of a team feel that we're getting rooked out of a game because of them, and I'm just as guilty of it. I'm sure the refs last night enjoyed reffing that game because 63 points, you know, 20 makes it very easy to ref that kind of game. But some of the other ones that have come down to the wire, and you know, as I said, it is a really hard thing. And the other part is I don't like seeing it, but right away, of course, whether it's on Twitter or anywhere, it's about, you know, is it fixed? Like the NBA referee. I don't think that it is at all. But I just think that there's so many, they just keep adding on new rules. In the old days, I was just talking to a guy that played defensive back for the Super Bowl III team. He called me the other day, Billy Baird. And we were talking about it, and he was a small guy, 5'10" and about 180 back in those days. And they hadn't, in fact, just he and Jerry Philbin were the only players that lifted weights because they thought lifting weights would make you too muscular and slow. So they started. But he said, man, you could clothesline. When a guy came across the middle, he said, I would just get ready to put my arm out and just clothesline the guy. You could hit, you know, everybody came back in. It was just a different, they practiced. And this is what I do think is hurting them, though, is they used to practice 2.5 hours in the morning, 2.5 hours in the afternoon, full pads, and getting ready for football. The CBA in 2011 seems to have changed everything. And now they don't bring the guys down to the ground. They seem to be getting hurt even more with all the protection. So as I said, the refs have a hard, you know, you could hit if you see some of the hits that were on Joe Namath with his helmet coming off or down low, and they weren't even called because that was okay. Now you can't hit real low. You can't hit high. So it is hard on the refs too. But I get mad at them just like everybody else. But I think the hardest part is people saying things about, well, you know, I guess it's rigged. Oh, it's rigged. No, I don't think that. But I do think that the more the betting gets around, there's just more temptation in life to do different things. Before it was, as I said, win or lose, maybe bet on a team, maybe something. But now there's just so much. So I just wonder how dangerous, how much more addiction there's going to be, and people not even realize that they are.
All right, so one last thing, and we'll get you out of here on this two-parter. First off, what are your biggest pet peeves that fans do? And then also along those lines, what's kind of one piece of advice that you would give sports fans out there to kind of preserve their mental health and well-being while still obviously being the passionate sports fans that they are?
I think it's, first of all, the vulgarity of people in the stands towards players and saying different things. And then the players, it gets under their skin and they respond. And that's the part. Before it was booing. Booing was okay. You know, you're not calling names. You're not swearing. You know, there's a lot of little kids at the games, but nobody seems to care anymore between all the drinking too that goes on. You know, tailgating is wonderful, but you're there for 4 hours. Then you come in and you're drinking some more. And there were always fights, but it seems like there's a lot more. So the pet peeve is probably that. And I would say that on the Jets part, as soon as a player is cut from another team, immediately all over Twitter is, let's get that guy. And, whether it was Josh Dobbs, I don't care who it was. And if you just have to wait a minute, because there's so many different schemes out there, different teams, how they fit in, the salary cap, what their scouts and their player personnel and general manager all feel, and their coaching staff. So there's so many things that we don't know. Some people are more on good character, some less. So that's the only thing. Is as soon as somebody gets cut, they go, oh, let's get him. And we went through that a lot with the Jets. And I love Ronnie Lott, and I love all those guys that we got, Mark Brunell, but we got them at the tail end. And they, were not what they were. And they were superstars at one point. So I think, you got to kind of just slow that down a little bit. And usually by Wednesday or Thursday of that week, we have slowed down.
All right. Well, Connie, this is truly, truly an honor. This is me. I mean, I feel like I could just talk to you for hours and hours on end, but thank you so much for joining us on the show.
I'm ready. Anytime. Talk football. And as I said, I love it when they have training camp and the players go over and talk to the fans. It's so meaningful. And that's what really helps a lot of fans. As I said, I think that's one of the biggest things is that personal touch, no matter what in life, no matter what it is, that they feel that. And I think that's a really big thing. And it helps you kind of have a little more patience and understanding after a loss or when you're going through the heartbreak, and know that there's another week coming up.
Fantastic. All right, Connie, thank you so much. When we come back, we're going to take a little bit deeper of a dive on the psychological side of sports fandom with Joshua Norman, Clinical Assistant Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Health at Ohio State University. We'll be right back. All right, so for our final segment today, we are joined by Joshua Norman, Clinical Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health at The Ohio State University. Joshua, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, of course. So we have had your coworker, I guess you could call it, Dr. Natalie Clegg, on here in a few episodes, and she actually put us in touch. So if you just want to share with us really quick, just a little bit about yourself, and then we'll just so the audience kind of knows a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So as you mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist at Ohio State. Some of my special interests are what's called consultation liaison psychiatry. So it's basically diagnosis and management of medically complex or medically admitted behavioral health patients. And then a very special interest of mine is sports psychiatry. I started the first sports psychiatry program at Ohio State, serving primarily just the OSU student athletes. I worked with all of the sports. And that's definitely something that's near and dear to my heart. I grew up playing sports my whole life, mainly baseball and football. And so that's definitely probably one of the favorite aspects of my career.
So you're kind of like the perfect guest for us to have on the show today, because not only do you work with athletes, but you're also a fan of sports yourself. So you can kind of break it down for us from both sides of the spectrum here, so to say. So I know for those of you that are just listening to the show, Joshua is currently inside the hospital working at the moment. So we're just going to get right into it, because obviously your time is precious, of course, and anything could pop up at any moment. So we're just going to get right into it. First question, and it's the question that kind of sparked the topic of the show today. Speaking purely from a mental health perspective, is being a sports fan healthy?
It can be. I think there's a lot of good that can come from sports, right? Sense of community. A lot of the fan bases are passionate, especially here at Ohio State. It's a passionate fan base. It can bring people together. It can really teach a lot about life and overcoming adversity and working as a team. And there can be a lot of great moments, but as we all know, as sports fans, there can be a lot of letdowns. And the fan bases typically take that pretty hard. So there can be kind of good and bad, but I think like all things in life, keeping a good balance and trying to enjoy the positives of anything is really the best approach, I would say.
So we talked a little bit about it earlier in the show, but you got to be wired a certain way. And I say this, I'm a massive sports fan too. You got to be wired a certain way to allow yourself the ability to experience such the highest of highs and lowest of lows when it comes to something that you have no control over. Like as sports fans, we're watching other people do this stuff. So how exactly does that work as far as like the wiring of the brain for us as sports fans to be able to allow ourselves to get so deeply involved in something that like we really don't have anything to do with as far as direct effect with?
Yeah, I think, I think that sports does give a certain escape in life too. A lot of times being a sports fan and following our favorite team, whether it was a family tradition or in college, a lot of us attended these schools. I think there's a lot of pride around, particularly in college sports and the universities. I think it's a nice escape from life. A lot of the reward circuitry in the brain when our team gets a big win, it's obviously very exciting. And I think that's what keeps us coming back through all the trials and tribulations of losing seasons. And I think also it gives a sense of hope, right? So one of the sports fans' favorite thing, a lot of Cleveland Browns fans up here in the area, there's always next year, right? There's always next season. Next season will be the one. And I think that hope is important, not just in sports, but also in life, to keep us motivated and engaged in all the things that we love.
So a little bit more about that, when it comes to the brain and when we're feeling good, obviously that you get that kind of dopamine release, and then, your brain reacts to that dopamine and acknowledges that, yeah, this is something that's good. So from that standpoint, how does the dopamine release that the brain does when something good happens being a sports fan, how does that kind of compare to the dopamine release when you look at maybe other vices, whether it be drugs, alcohol, gambling, exercise, anything else that may also produce that similar euphoric effects?
Yeah, I think there can be a lot of similarities. Obviously substances we know can cause a lot of changes in the reward circuitry, particularly like you mentioned through dopamine. But I think sports fandom can also have parallels, and it's good that you mentioned gambling, especially with the sports betting being such a hot topic here of late. And I think those are important things to even watch out for as fans. It can bring a unique aspect to the game, whether we're, betting on some of the fun prop bets or some of the other goofy stuff, or, overall wins and losses, different player stats. But a lot been similar to other, substances or other types of things in addiction medicine, being aware as it's starting to impact relationships or ability to perform on the job, or impacting financial responsibilities or obligations. So I think there are a lot of similarities between the reward circuitry, whether it's just getting that thrill of winning a national championship or a Big Ten or conference championship. There can be a lot of parallels through other types of either addiction or those types of things.
So beyond just kind of the dopamine and whatnot, are there other ways where the emotional investment required to be a sports fan, are there other ways that can mimic addictive behaviors? And if so, how can kind of fans recognize those signs, to kind of maybe bring it back a little bit, or just kind of know what's going on?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing we always look for is some type of impairment, right, in functioning. So, it's good to go to the games and enjoy the games and follow our favorite teams, but is it starting to impact their quality of life? And that could be through changes in sleep, changes in relationship, changes in appetite. Are you noticing a persistently low mood more often than not? Or are you starting to lose interest in some of your favorite things, whether that's sports or, working out or exercise or playing guitar or whatever somebody's hobbies are? Is it impacting, like I mentioned, ability to attend work or financial responsibility? So I think those types of things are kind of the fine line when we start noticing someone's quality of life decreasing or their ability to function well. That's when you start wondering, is this a sign of something that might be evolving, like a depressive disorder or anxiety disorder or something along those lines?
So along that note, do you think that being a sports fan can directly lead to both mental health struggles and even addiction issues beyond? I mean, obviously the gambling part of it kind of goes hand in hand, but more kind of even severe issues.
I would say it's possible. I think at large for a lot of the fan bases, sports bring a lot of positivity, but it is certainly possible. I think especially for those that have a heavy identity rooted in either being a fan of their team or a fan of that sport, and even for people who played sports, throughout their life and then have transitioned to now being a fan. I think there's a lot of athletic identity rooted in that. And I think folks that have that greater identity are at a greater risk of having mental health disorders developed related to sports. So one thing I often talk about with the athletes that I see is really fostering that sense of yourself outside of your sport. I think for all of us at some point, whether we played or have even just as fans, you go through bad seasons as a fan or as an athlete, you're going to have those times where, your sport will end, whether it's from injury or getting cut from a team, whether it's college or pro. And I think having a good sense of self outside of that can be protected toward developing mental health conditions. But I've noticed for folks that have a higher identity when it comes to being a sports fan or athlete, the risk is certainly there for mental health conditions. Usually, like you mentioned, either substance use, depression, or anxiety most common.
So I think, and you touched on a little bit too, one of the funnest and coolest parts of being a sports fan is that community aspect. Obviously, you go to the games, you're tailgating, you're surrounded by, well, in the case of Ohio State, 100,000 people all, rooting for Ohio State, but even, in smaller venues, and you do have that sense of community and that social kind of connection and outreach. Are there aspects of that kind of social and community kind of bonding and feeling that can help mitigate, so to say, some of those kind of maybe more negative aspects of the mental health side of being a fan? Like, can being around all those people maybe help, if it's a really tough loss, can being around all those other fans and kind of sympathizing and feeling sad together help, as opposed to feeling that way just being by yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think sense of community is huge in sports and also in life, and it's very protective toward a lot of things, mental health conditions, even suicide. Having a good social support around is a protective factor. So And I think having that collective experience, when you go through a loss and you have a lot of, good friends in the community that are fans, you guys can all kind of relate to one another. And also, I think it helps keep perspective and keep grounded too. There's always that one guy or a gal in the group that says, hey, guys, it's just a game, right? It's just a game. And there's the next season. And I think that kind of helps to keep our selves distracted and moving forward. But 100%, it can be very protective having that sense of community as a sports fan.
So as sports gambling becomes more and more of a thing and fantasy sports is as popular as it's ever been, obviously that can be good for sports because it can kind of bring in more fans and it can bring in more people to enjoy the game. But obviously it also kind of has its negative connotations as well. And there are bad things that can happen with it too. So with sports gambling and with fantasy sports, how does that change how the modern fan now kind of engages with sports?
Yeah, I think kind of like you mentioned, it can bring in maybe people that might have been more peripheral fans, and I think it adds a really neat and interesting dynamic to the game. Because as we've seen, there's prop bets, there's all these interesting games within the game, different stat lines you can follow, or just betting on wins and losses. So I think it does add an interesting component to the game. And it gets probably brings more people in than would typically maybe be, or have people be more engaged with the game. And I think a lot about even like my friends that are in fantasy football, the way they watch the game is quite a bit different than myself, who's not in fantasy but just loves football. They're into who's scoring and and all that kind of stuff. I think it's really cool. It has an interesting element,
I'm a big fantasy football guy, and there are plenty of weeks where I find myself watching games in the NFL where I probably wouldn't be watching them if I didn't have a player or my opponent didn't have a player going in them, and all of a sudden now I'm glued to it like it's a Dolphins game, and I'm watching intently every single play. But see, for me, that kind of adds the more fun of it because it makes it more exciting to watch games that I may not have otherwise been interested in. But of course, obviously, there is that line where it can also become, not so healthy, which is, kind of what we've been talking about. Shifting a little bit, football specifically, as we were talking about fantasy football. So this time of year, the holidays, they tend to be a fun time. You're surrounded by a lot of family and friends, but unfortunately for some people, the holidays aren't a fun time, and they can actually lead to mental health issues and depression and other issues like that. Coupled with that, this is typically the time of the year where teams start getting eliminated from playoff contention, and then as we get closer to the new year, the playoffs start, and then teams actually get eliminated from the playoffs altogether. The question I guess would be is is there a correlation between kind of the grief and sadness of being eliminated from the playoffs and then the stresses of the holiday time that could kind of create this perfect storm of just mental anguish and suffering?
Yeah, absolutely. They can have a compounding effect. I think like you mentioned, the holiday time in general can bring up sometimes bad memories for folks or a sense of loneliness or being around maybe challenging family members that, not necessarily bring out the best in us. And I think when you're a big sports fan and you have the compounded, issue of maybe having your favorite team struggle or your favorite team lose in the playoffs or be eliminated from the playoffs, I think there can be that sense of loss, that can be compounded. And, so I think it's important through the holidays or through challenging times or through, tough losses for fans to, engage in grounding things, keep proper exercise, try to keep good nutrition throughout the holidays. We all have a tendency to probably eat more than we should or not maintain our nutrition or not sleep as well as we should. So I think kind of keeping a sense of routine and keeping healthy habits can really help to give us the best foundation possible to navigate challenging aspects of the year, whether it's, the football season or going through challenging times in the holidays.
So we spent most of this episode so far talking about the fan side of things, and you work a lot with athletes, so you can kind of touch on this. There's a little bit different perspective of things, but fans, obviously we talk about, we feel the highest of highs and the lowest of lows during an event. And, unfortunately sometimes we don't always think rationally, especially when something bad happens at maybe an end of a game, a kicker misses a kick or something doesn't go our way. And in the old days, we might've just vented on a message board or called the local sports show or talked about it, on Monday at work at the water cooler. But now in today's modern age of social media, it's really easy for now a fan to get really upset at a certain player or something that happened, immediately fire up their Twitter and tweet at that person. And they may, not be thinking rationally, and they may say some truly awful, horrible things. And then you have the athlete now who already probably feels bad enough because they cost their team the game, reading all these like hateful messages and all these things from these fans. And so I guess it's a long way of saying, how does that affect the athlete too? Like, we obviously, it affects us as the fan in a certain way, but how does all that now also affect the athlete?
It's extremely challenging, I would say. I think especially, in college athletics, especially, I think we, as a fan base, sometimes we lose sight that these are, 18 to 22-year-old, very young men. And I would say no one wants that win or to do well more than the players and the coach. And, they dedicate a tremendous amount of time to their craft. They're up at 5 a.m. and they're in the weight room. They're going through football drills. They're going through drills in their respective sports. Going through all the nuances of the sport, all the particular coaching, and then they have to manage academics on top of that. And then, sometimes even have 2-a-days in the case of football. A lot of the players really don't like mat drills. That's definitely a challenging aspect of it. And, I think when they struggle in a game or make a mistake, their players take that the hardest. And I think it can help a lot to have a more supportive or encouraging fan base. But I think sometimes those comments that get fired off on Twitter can obviously be, below the belt or a little out of line from the fan base. And I think it's just important to remember that the student athletes or the pro athletes in general take that typically the hardest, and they really devote their entire life to this craft. And it's tremendously taxing on them, both physically and mentally, I would say.
Yeah, and you look at today's like modern athlete. You look at somebody like, say, Michael Jordan, for example. And I know I've used him as examples in previous episodes, but you look at somebody like Michael Jordan, like sure. Did he have to deal with people yelling at him in the arena? Yeah, of course. I think everyone does that. But then he gets to go home and he gets to sit in his house with his family and he gets to just sit in some peace and quiet and reflect and just go about his life. And now, unfortunately, like I said, with social media, now the athletes have to hear it in stadium and then they go home. And yes, of course, I'm sure some of them probably try to avoid social media. But once again, you talk about an 18 or 19-year-old kid, just like us, like they live on social media too. And so obviously sometimes there's no way of avoiding seeing those comments. How does the modern day athlete that kind of grew up in that social media world, how do they then now have to navigate something that, say, their parents or the athletes that they looked up to didn't have to? Because so they can't really go to them and say, well, what did you do here? Because there's nothing for them to come back and say, oh, this is what I did, because it didn't exist.
Exactly. Yeah, it's tough. There's not, like you mentioned, that generation before. I've been thinking about, what if social media or TikTok was around during, Jordan's Bulls run, having the stuff, I think of Dennis Rodman and all these guys back in the day. So yeah, it is a very interesting dynamic now. They're unable to really disconnect from a lot of the fan bases. And, I often tell a lot of the folks I see to just say, if you can, stay off Instagram, stay off Twitter, or now X. Obviously it can bring a lot of challenging aspects to it. And I think it's protective, not every opinion that's mentioned through Twitter or some of the things that are rolled out there deserves that weight. And I always try to, reinforce that, the players really know the day-to-day and the day-to-day challenges of how incredibly hard it is to be a college or a professional athlete and the work that's involved. But oftentimes fan bases on, Twitter or social media don't necessarily appreciate all the behind-the-scenes things. They just see that one mistake on that one play and they forget to kind of humanize the situation. And also the way it influences culture too, right? You think about the heat on the coaches these days too, one bad loss and it's, fire the head coach and they start bringing steam and, the fan base gets real rowdy. And I think it's important, even for those making those decisions to remember, all of the great qualities. Like I think about Ryan Day a lot and what a tremendous coach he is. And, there is that fan base. If we lose to Michigan, they get quite angry about that. But I think it's always important to keep in perspective what a tremendous coach he is, what a tremendous man he is, and how much he cares about the players. I think that's also a really important thing to keep in mind.
It's interesting. I just thought too. You bring up coaches. They're also in a really unique position because and so are the players. But a lot of these players are younger and they may not have settled down yet. They may not have a family yet. But obviously these coaches are older. They have a wife. They have children. And they're out and about within the community. So you think about, for example, Ryan Day, after the Michigan loss, maybe everyone, obviously I'm sure everyone was upset about it, but like the next day, his kids still went to school and whatnot. And, there's that aspect of, and unfortunately we've heard about it before too, where the children of these athletes or coaches then also maybe they get bullied in school, or somebody says something to them because, you know, they heard their parents say it, so they said it to the child of the coach. I mean, there's a domino effect in there beyond just the athlete or the coach themselves, because there's other people in those people's lives that also can be adversely affected by it as well.
Yeah, 100%, man. I think it is extremely, just like you said, extremely challenging on their families, their kids, their significant others. And I think it's just, as a society, always important to, you know, humanize things, assume positive intent. Remember, we're all trying to do our best. Sometimes things don't go the way we'd hope, whether it's wins and losses in sports or in life. But I think just keeping that at the forefront is extremely important, because it is incredibly challenging on the coaching staff. And I think, you know, as a society, sometimes we have a tendency to kind of separate sports from all these other type of careers that folks do. But, you know, day to day, that is also a career. And, you know, we wouldn't like, maybe as physicians, to get scrutinized, you know, through Twitter, if that was the thing, right? If we prescribe the wrong medicine, I can imagine on a much larger scale, what like the coach, right? So.
So we'll get you out of here on one kind of more positive note, obviously, maybe something that can help those out there who may be listening and struggling. You know, hopefully this episode today did a good job of kind of breaking down that stigma of disgusting mental health when it comes to sports fandom. Beyond just this conversation we're having, how can we all as a whole, as sports fans, continue to break that stigma down? And then beyond just that, what kind of resources are available for those that may be listening to this and saying, yeah, you know, maybe I am being negatively impacted by my sports fandom. Maybe it is really not healthy for me. What can I do to still enjoy sports, but do it in a more healthy manner?
Yeah. Resources are tremendous out there. I think one thing I see a lot is maybe not as much knowledge around what is available. And I think, you know, not knowing what to access can be the hardest thing sometimes. So I think there are a lot of psychiatrists out there, which are medical doctors that, you know, prescribe medicine and can offer therapy-based services. There's psychologists and social work clinicians that are, you know, can offer psychotherapy-based services. And a few good websites. One is called psychologytoday.com, and you can search through insurance, location, type of provider you're looking for if you feel as if you may be experiencing depression or anxiety or troubles with sleep or ADHD. And then also at Iowa State, we have a behavioral health department that's available for everyone. And Dan, what was the first part of that question? It was escaping my memory.
What other than just this conversation you and I are having, what else can we all do as sports fans to kind of break the stigma of like mental health and sports? There's a connection there, and it is a real thing, and it's important, much in the same way we would with any other vice, to talk about it and to get it out in the open.
Yes. Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, the biggest thing is normalizing the discussion, right? And having people that are willing to do that. I think in sports, there's, especially in football, right, or basketball or baseball, there's this concept of toughness, which gets brought up a lot, you know. And I think toughness is all about perspective. And I think some of the toughest people are those that are willing to be honest about things, willing to be open, have an open dialogue about not just the good in life, but also the challenging aspects of life. And I think that's one thing I do admire a lot about Coach Day, and then also Harry Miller was a player that spoke out. And I really admire both of them. It took a lot of courage to speak about their own experiences. And I've seen clinically how much they have influenced other patients that have come to see me. They brought up these stories and said, you know, without that story, I don't know that I'd be here today, or I don't know that I would have sought that. So I think as a fan base, encouraging one another, supporting one another, having an open dialogue about those things, and also normalizing the discussion. These are very common things that affect a lot of people. I think that can help a lot to facilitate the discussion around mental health and improve the overall culture and stigma.
All right, well, Joshua, Norman, thank you so much for joining me today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, man. You have a great day.
Yeah, you too. All right, that will do it for this episode of the Victory Over Vices podcast. Thank you so much to Connie and Joshua for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed our discussion on sports fandom and what it does to the brain and how it affects all of our mental health. So if you did enjoy it, please continue to like, subscribe, rate, and review the show. Please continue to share it with your friends, family members, and loved ones, and have them like, subscribe, rate, and review as well. If you want to watch the video portion of the show, you can find us on YouTube for those audio-only people who prefer the audio experience only. You can find us on Spotify and anywhere else you may get your podcasts. And of course, at the end of every episode, we like to remind people that if you or a loved one is struggling It's okay to not be okay, but please go ahead and get yourself the help that you need. Go ahead and visit the addictionhelp.com website. Ton of great information on the website, whether it's about this topic we talked about today, anything else involving mental health, substance abuse, or addiction. There's also some great resource pages as far as getting the process started to get the help you need. So, like I said, that will do it for us on this episode of the podcast. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll talk to you guys next time. See you later.